It's winter in London. Everything has gone grey. I turn out of the rain into an ordinary-looking cafe. There's a man waiting to talk to me, because it's my job to find stories for an investigative history show called Document, and he has some documents to show me. He's convinced he's onto something huge. We drink tea and talk for a long time. And he does have a great story to tell, but it's just a little bit too dependent on wishful thinking and hidden evidence. That's sort of how it happened, usually. But obviously there was no music, and it wasn't really raining. There are real conspiracies, and then there are unreal conspiracies. The experience of trying to tell them apart got me fascinated by how we end up immersed in this stuff. Because conspiracy theories tell stories about power. But so do journalism and history, which need to be built on evidence, and fiction, which works to completely different rules. Maybe thinking about all this in terms of stories might tell us something about how we think about the workings of power.
This is like a global takeover. They're trying to create a new world order, right? They're trying to create a one world government. That means there's like over 180 countries involved in all this stuff.
So this is Conspiracies, The Secret Knowledge. Episode 1, Some Smoky Back Room.
There's plenty of media in the United States that points to this almost taken for granted idea that there's a group of people, usually men, in some smoky back room making deals about things. It's not then surprising at all that these ideas about secret worlds and sort of invisible truths and people behind the scenes controlling things, those get mapped onto things that happen in the news quite easily.
Whitney Phillips of Syracuse University and co-author of You Are Here, a guide to navigating conspiracy theories. Powerful people have always met in rooms and conspired to do bad things. The question is how far the power of any such conspiracy could reach without being exposed, or just failing. Today's conspiracy theories can make huge claims about that. So when did this begin, and why? I asked Brian Chiette of the University of Reading and Michael Butter of the University of Tübingen.
At the turn of the 20th century, we experienced globalization and modernization on a very different scale, also due to the advent of many new technologies. And I think that we see this reflected in a development towards what is sometimes called super conspiracy theories.
Political science was growing, and they were trying to understand the nature of power in relatively new formed nation states. The Irish and the Jews, with their people living all over the world, did that mean that they didn't owe their allegiance to the nation state? Secret societies, the Freemasons, bankers, Bolsheviks, they all were alternative sources of power, as were the aristocracy. And so conspiracies were an answer to this power vacuum, the idea that power lies in secret, behind the scenes.
Professor Richard Evans, author of The Hitler Conspiracies, The Third Reich and the Paranoid Imagination, argues that there is a more specific explanation.
What inspired conspiracy theories, particularly before World War I, the anarchist movement, which resulted in an astonishing number of plots to assassinate leading politicians. President of France was assassinated, Sadi Carnot. McKinley, the President of the United States, was assassinated, the Empress of Austria. And this resulted, I think, in a paranoia, which was satirized in G.K. Chesterton's little novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, which is about an anarchist group, secret plotting, in which it turns out in the end every single member is a secret policeman who's infiltrated the group.
So that's one smoky back room. Chesterton's 1908 novel imagines the Central Anarchist Council meeting in a secret underground steel chamber festooned with bombs. 5 years later, as Paul Cobley of the University of Middlesex told me, another writer, John Buchan, expanded on the idea of anarchist plotters to create an early version of an idea that is still alive and thriving right now. The vast international conspiracy led by a single, evil mastermind.
The Powerhouse involves an anarchist conspiracy which is run by a very wealthy individual called Andrew Lumley.
Did you ever reflect, Mr. Beetham, how precarious is the tenure of the civilization we boast about?
And it's uncovered by a Tory MP who appears in a number of Buchan's stories, Edward Leatham.
A little mechanical device will wreck your navies. A new chemical combination will upset every rule of war. It is the same with our commerce. One or two minute changes might sink Britain to the level of Ecuador, or give China the key of the world's wealth.
It does have this theme of tentacles stretching out across states. It reminds me of the network that Professor Moriarty has in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Professor Moriarty has somebody working everywhere.
Buchan imagines Lumley and his infinity of minions exploiting something new, the vulnerability of the interconnected world's ever more complicated systems. And the novel sets up another lasting notion. The conspiracy claims possession of secret knowledge, in this case destructive technology. But why do Lumley and his powerhouse want to destroy civilization?
Some say that it's Nietzschean, some say that it's highly individualistic. The truth is, it's very difficult to work out what it is that Lumley wants, although he does crave power, and he craves power in this international fashion.
By 1913, the confident world of Buchan's high Victorian youth looked decidedly rickety. It's not surprising he entertained himself, imagining a single implacable force that could destroy it. But wait, up against the tentacles of the conspiracy stands Edward Leatham, our plucky gentleman amateur.
Once in Piccadilly, there could be no doubt about my watches. Now the whole energies of the powerhouse were on the job. I was alone in that great crowd, isolated and proscribed, and there was no help save in my own wits. Now I saw how thin is the protection of civilization.
Leatham is just one of these fellows who emerge to fight conspirators across the pages of Edwardian thrillers, though usually they're battling supposedly vast networks of German spies. Our actual security services were driven into existence by much the same fears. And here's another archetype that's still going strong today: the accidental but heroic investigator doing his own research. Then, in 1914, the globalised economy tipped into global war. In response, Buchan created another accidental investigator, in a novel that has never been out of print in the 106 years since: The 39 Steps. Richard Hannay is a bored businessman who's pitched into his adventures when a jittery young conspiracy theorist called Franklin P. Scudder collars him with a story about a plot that stretches across Europe.
I got the first hint in an inn on the Achensee in Tyrol. That set me inquiring, and I collected my other clues in a fur shop in the Galician quarter of Buda, in a strangers' club in Vienna, and in a little bookshop off the Rachnisstrasse in Leipzig. I completed my evidence 10 days ago in Paris.
Scudder is convinced that a bizarre alliance of anarchists and financiers wants to use an assassination to trigger a European war. Both groups hope to profit from the chaos. This fused the international anarchist plotting of the powerhouse with a more poisonous kind of conspiracy fiction.
Before the First World War, they were mainly small-scale conspiracies. They were collusions between corrupt politicians and Jewish financiers, and we can see this in the fiction of Hilaire Belloc.
Brian Cheyette, author of Constructions of the Jew in English Literature and Society.
The 39 Steps look back to the earlier period where you had smaller scale conspiracies, but also look forward to the global conspiracies. You had, at the very beginning of the novel, Scudder's idea of the global Jewish conspiracy, away behind the governments and the armies. There was a big subterranean movement going on, engineered by very dangerous people. He tells Hannay, take any big Teutonic business concern, if you're on the biggest kind of job and are bound to get to the real boss,
10 to 1, you're brought up against a little white-faced Jew in a bath chair with an eye like a rattlesnake. Yes, sir. He's the man who's ruling the world just now.
So what that novel does is anticipate the idea of a global Jewish conspiracy.
Conspiracy theories involving Jews as subversive begin with the French Revolution in 1789 and then with the 1848 largely failed revolutions. And conservatives tended to see intellectuals as being behind these, and in particular, some conservatives saw them as a kind of Jewish plot against the established order.
In 1917, the idea of a world conspiracy suddenly caught fire. With the war still raging, Bolshevik revolutionaries seized control of the biggest country on the planet. How could such a thing have happened? Amid the clamour for explanations and sudden paranoia about revolution spreading across war-torn Europe, a malicious forgery came to light that seemed to some to offer an answer.
There's a document that emerges about 1903 called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This purports to be the minutes, i.e. protocols, of a meeting held in secret by Jewish elders from different countries on the fringes of the Zionist Congress in Switzerland in 1897. And in this, the elders record their plots and plans to subvert economies by encouraging speculation, to eventually foment revolutions, and to take over the world, to replace the Pope with a Jewish elder, and so on. This was translated from Russian into other languages after the First World War and got a very wide currency.
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion were actually published in the Morning Post in 1920 under the title of The Cause of the World Unrest. You had a general sense of global anarchy, of things falling apart, of the old order completely disappearing. And I think it was in that vacuum that the idea of a global conspiracy rather than a more event-led conspiracy took hold. These conspiracies, I think, are still more or less everywhere. I can take a taxi and have taken a taxi where the taxi driver will tell me that 9/11 was a Jewish conspiracy. We're told quite often in popular social media that COVID is somehow a Jewish conspiracy. Don't ask me how.
The Protocols purports to show the elders revealing that liberalism and democracy are just tricks to throw a well-ordered world into chaos, opening the way for their supposed conspiracy to take over. This racist scapegoating is vicious enough in itself. As a story, it depends on the idea of a ludicrously sprawling, vague, yet perfectly hidden plot.
This will put both sides at the mercy of our international agents and agencies, which possess millions of eyes, ever on the watch, and unhampered by any limitations whatsoever.
This is the logic of paranoid racism, but also of fiction and folktale, of infinitely powerful forces that don't need explaining because their role in the narrative is to be the omnipotent monster. But it's presented as though it's true. Michael Butter points out that you can see this slippage from fiction to supposed fact playing out in the work of one of the Protocol's cheerleaders in Britain, an aristocratic writer of novels about the French Revolution, called Nesta Helen Webster.
The research that she did for these historical novels apparently made her rediscover claims about an Illuminati plot at the heart of the French Revolution. So a couple of years later, she publishes a non-fictional book in which she repeats these claims, but then she throws the Jews and later also the communists into the mixture. So she begins by writing fiction and she ends up making factual conspiracy theory claims. And this is something that we observe again and again in the history of conspiracy theories.
And lo and behold, it turned out that the Protocols was not just fake, it was fiction.
So in 1921, Philip Graves, the Istanbul correspondent of The Times, exposed the Protocols as a tissue of falsifications. He printed passages of the Protocols side by side in The Times with extracts and documents from which they had been plagiarized. There's two main documents here. There's a satire against the Emperor Napoleon III by a French writer called Maurice Joly, which purports to be a dialogue between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, where Machiavelli puts forward all these sort of extremely underhand ways of subverting society in an amoral manner, and those are sort of twisted in the Protocol to appear as if they're Jewish.
For the sake of victory, we must keep to a program of violence and make-believe. Through the power of the press, we have gained the power to influence while remaining ourselves in the shade.
And then there's also something called the Rabbi's Speech, which is an extract from a German Gothic novelist. And those are kind of cobbled together and then matched up with some additional material from their Russian compiler. It's a kind of conservative picture of a world that the Jews were allegedly trying to subvert.
By putting what used to be satire into an entirely different context, of course, it takes on a completely different meaning, and it had horrible consequences.
So, once this had been revealed, did British novelists stop including Jewish conspiracies in their fiction?
Sadly not.
One of the most worrying things about conspiracy theorists is quite often they say, well, all right, we can't prove it, but Anyway, we know. So the fact that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a forgery is neither here nor there. What they do is they point to a deeper reality. And you find actually Hitler and his propaganda minister Goebbels actually saying this. Well, we don't know. It may not be true, but it's kind of essentially true. So even if the protocols are a forgery, a falsification, actually they point to the real truth underneath them, which is that the Jews are always fomenting conspiracy to take over the world. And that's why I think the protocols don't have an independent impact on anti-Semitic thinking. The prejudice is already there, that they're just seen to be a kind of proof of it. When the Times exposed the protocols as a forgery, Hitler said, oh, the Times is a Jewish newspaper, you can't pay any attention to it.
In febrile Germany, defeated in the First World War, right-wing extremists were clamouring for the killing of traitors. They turned their attention to the foreign minister, Walter Rathenau, a businessman who'd been vital to Germany's economic mobilisation for war, who was also Jewish. Rathenau had once complained that Europe's economic destinies were guided by 300 people who all knew each other. This was twisted into evidence that the 300 were somehow the secret Jewish government, and that he was one of them.
A small group of far-right extremists plotted his assassination, which they carried out. They were really, really young, and they confessed that they had been inspired to do this by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Rathenau's assassination was incredibly unpopular in Germany. There were 1 million people at his funeral.
Amid the chaos of a weak, fledgling democracy beset by extremist violence and galloping inflation, some on the left were also attracted to the sense that ordinary Germans were at the mercy of unseen forces. A few months before Rathenau was killed, the director Fritz Lang wove many of the conspiracy story elements we've been tracing into his monumental movie Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, about a conspiratorial mastermind with hypnotising eyes.
He's about control, and it's almost as if the ability to control is an end in itself.
Film historian Pamela Hutchinson.
We also know that he's got many, many people working for him, these underlings. He's got a manservant, he's got a chauffeur come assassin. He even has a factory producing counterfeit money.
Like Andrew Lumley in The Powerhouse, Dr. Mabuse and his synchronised minions exploit the vulnerabilities of modern, interconnected systems. And like many fictional conspirators, he operates with perfect, efficient precision.
He's like the fast, mechanised pace of the 1920s Germany. And we see him intercepting a train, and there's telephones and things like this. We know that he's got a mastery of technology. He orchestrates the theft of an international trade contract. He capitalises on the news report that the trade contract has been stolen, and we watch the stock market go into panic. There's a man in the stock exchange frantically writing new prices for the stock and rubbing them out and going down lower and lower and lower. And then, of course, Dr. Mabuse buys a lot of stock, and then it is revealed that actually the contract is safe and well, and the value of the stock just soars. And at the end of this frenetic day on the trading floor, all this frenzy of buying and selling, we see the trading floor in tatters, notes everywhere. And we have Dr. Mabuse's face superimposed.
In that scene, Mabuse is posing as a stock trader. Like the German spy who impersonates a cabinet minister in the 39 Steps, he's a master of disguise.
We see him selecting one of several personae from a kind of pack of playing cards, and we know that he has an ability to transform himself utterly into a different character. A psychiatrist or a showman, he'll be a gambler, he'll be an upper-class person, and this is one of the ways that he manages to escape undetected and to have such a pervasive influence on the world, is that he is everywhere and nowhere at all times.
So far, we've been tracing how prose fiction about conspiracy developed alongside and even informed conspiracy theories in the real world. But Dr. Mabuse shows how the logic of drama also informs conspiracy thinking.
This idea of hiddenness is, I think, really crucial to all conspiracy theories. That the world is not what it seems to be, that you have to look behind the curtain to figure out what is really going on.
And what's any film or play but a spectacle where nothing is as it seems? Mabuse is a story about those tricks of makeup and costume and performance being deployed in the real world. It's true that to some extent, democratic politics is theatre. Dictatorships even stage show trials. But it's one thing to say that someone in the public eye is acting, different to say that they're an actor. And today, some conspiracy theorists in America claim that even the arrival of a new president or school shootings are fictional dramas.
She tells her daughter that she thinks that the White House is a set.
He was like, Joe Biden's not even real. Like, that's why he's wearing a mask all the time, because the fake face that he's wearing, the mouth doesn't move correctly when he talks.
Finding any inconsistency in any footage that's being shown online and then freeze framing it and drawing circles and lines and arrows on it and claiming that this is fake, that's staged, this person is practicing their lines.
This implies that somewhere in a backroom there's a Mabuza figure casting and scripting and directing the spectacle. But theatre and film and TV depend on our willing suspension of disbelief. Talking about the real world as if it's staged depends on a different idea, that most people are being fooled by a vast conspiracy. Fritz Lang blurs this line. Mabuza poses as a stage hypnotist, banishing the curtain to reveal a desert, from which men appear to process down off the stage through the audience, but then vanish.
The scene of mass hypnosis does seem to be typical Lang in that it shows a group of people as a mob being easily led. There does seem to me a suggestion of something of the power of cinema to lead the audience here. For a filmmaker who was as cynical and pessimistic as Lang could be, the idea that he would be almost implicating his own art form in this kind of misleading process does seem to be the kind of thing that he would be interested in doing.
This is one of many images in Lang's movie of a powerful manipulator tricking a powerless crowd. Even so, Mabuza was subverting the system from the outside. Back in Britain, some on the left had developed theories that located conspiracies closer to the heart of power.
The Jewish global conspiracy theories were mainly of the purview of the radical right, those that were very suspicious of liberal democracy. There were many socialists who believed in Jewish conspiracy theories, and it was dismissed as the socialism of fools, but it was very much part of the politics of the time. A good example of this is J.A. Hobson. He is a great theorist of imperialism. He published a book on South Africa in 1900, where he said that the Boer War, and the Boer War had started in 1899, was a Jew imperialist design.
If that war triggered left-wing conspiracies about finance and its connections to governments, the First World War did the same for the international arms industry. In the 1930s, as new war fears rose, a book called Merchants of Death drove the British government to set up a royal commission to ask if the trade should be ended. But beyond the accusations that the arms industry profited from war, which was obviously true, there was a more conspiratorial accusation abroad, that they started wars deliberately and were at it again. Among the members of the public attending the Royal Commission was a young novelist called Graham Greene, and in 1936 he dramatised this conspiracy theory in a thriller called A Gun for Sale.
Sir Marcus read in the tape messages that the two governments chiefly concerned would not either amend or accept the terms of the ultimatum.
At the centre of the plot is Sir Marcus, the head of Midland Steel, who's commissioned the assassination of a Czech politician to trigger a European conflict.
Probably within 5 days, at least 4 countries would be at war, and the consumption of munitions have risen to several £1 million a day.
Greene's character did have some grounding in reality. Sir Marcus was inspired by a Russian-Greek armaments super salesman called Sir Basil Zakharov, who came to symbolise how the arms trade had done well out of the First World War. He was corrupt and devious and claimed he'd provoke wars so he could sell arms to both sides. When he died in 1936, British Movie Tone announced the news in theatrical terms that made him sound like Dr. Mabuza.
The mystery man of Europe, Sir Basil Zakharov, is dead. A power behind the scenes in the German war.
But alongside these real-world influences, Greene was also drawing on the conspiracy set out in the 39 Steps. Sir Marcus orchestrates events from another smoky back room, in this case his office at the top of his company's building. Greene was progressive, Buchan was conservative, and yet their imaginary conspiracies have something else in common.
Sir Marcus, just like the Jewish figure, the white-faced Jew in a bath chair behind everything in the 39 Steps, also sits in a bath chair. So there's no question at all that A Gun for Sale follows a 39 Steps. Graham Greene, after the facts of the Holocaust were publicised, actually changed a lot of his pre-war novels with Jewish figures in new editions. And at times, Sir Marcus is very much known as a Jew, but far fewer times than in the original edition of the novel. Graham Greene, I think, has to be commended for changing the novel.
As for Sir Basil Zaharoff, he continued to inspire conspiracy theories, sometimes anti-Semitic ones. And he inspired fictional characters too. Some writers have contended that Zaharoff was an inspiration for that other international man of mystery, Ian Fleming's Bond villain, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. And the early Bond movies certainly stretched the conspiracy stories we've been collecting to their limit, leaving a lurid, lasting image of invisible, efficient conspiracy, run by a man with a white cat.
Sit down, number 2. We will discuss your NATO project later.
In Thunderball, for instance, directed by Terence Young and written by Richard Maybaum and John Hopkins, Blofeld's smoky backroom is the size of several tennis courts, with a huge world map which lights up to show how his organisation's tentacles reach everywhere.
Number 11.
Distribution of Red China narcotics in the United States.
But by 1965, the new nerve centre of conspiracy theories was the power that had superseded Britain. Back amid the war fears of the mid-1930s, Hollywood was already worrying about the arms industry corrupting American politics. In William Wellman's 1934 movie, The President Vanishes, Kerry Wilson's script shows us a lobbyist, an industrialist, a banker, a newspaper magnate, a judge and an oilman meeting over dinner to plot the toppling of the anti-war president.
There's too much sentimental talk about the last war. What did it really cost us? 400,000 casualties. Nothing. It gave us the greatest year of prosperity any nation's ever had.
A crucial element of the coup plot is the manipulation of the public, who was shown as gullible gossips laying the ground for a lynch mob in this film from 1936.
My wife's sister called up and told her that a friend of hers told her...
Fury was directed by Fritz Lang, who'd fled the Nazis and brought his fear of mass manipulation to America. And it's an early example of a movie genre that would come to encapsulate America's way of thinking about conspiracy. In film noir, instead of Edwardian gentleman adventurers, the lone investigator up against the conspiracy is often a journalist, as in 1939's Each Dawn I Die.
One a brilliant newspaper man, whose daring in exposing corruption and smashing crime brings him the enmity of the invisible rulers of a great city.
In 1942, Graham Greene's A Gun for Sale became the film noir This Gun for Hire, with Jewish conspirators replaced by businessmen selling weapons to the fascist enemy. After the war, America became a land of astonishing bigness and complexity, a land of spies and secret knowledge, in which it wasn't always straightforward to spot the difference between a real and a fake conspiracy. In episode 2, we'll see what the noirish, paranoid land of Nixon and Kennedy might tell us about today.
Today, General Walker lives a careful and guarded existence in this house in Dallas, where the blinds are always down.
Dallas, Texas. December 1963.
The bell is answered and the inner door opened by his bodyguard. General Walker's precautions may all seem a little melodramatic, but not so much perhaps when you remember that every day he gets anonymous letters and telephone calls threatening to kill him, and that on April the 10th last, at 9:30 in the evening, a bullet missed General Walker's head by something less than an inch as he sat writing at his desk.
America, the most powerful state on the planet, is alive with conspiracy theories about who really wields that power. Conspiracy theories that still shape how we think now. But how do we tell a real conspiracy from an unreal one? In this episode, I want to see what some innovative research on the structure of conspiracy narratives might tell us about the America of Nixon and Kennedy, and what we might take from that today. So this is Conspiracies, The Secret Knowledge, Episode 2. Narrative Graphs.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we continue this socialism, alias liberalism, we are going to destroy ourselves!
In the early 1960s, some on the American right were still mourning the crusading anti-communist Senator Joe McCarthy. And General Edwin Walker, that man in the closely guarded house in Dallas, had made himself the heir to McCarthy's conspiracy theories about dark forces at the heart of big government.
This today is a disgrace to the nation, in dire peril.
Walker fell out with the Kennedy administration, resigned from the army, and marched into politics. In 1962, he led resistance to desegregation in Mississippi, and as captured by BCINA, he called for violent vocal protest against a vaguely defined conspiracy from within.
This is the conspiracy of the crucifixion by the Antichrist conspirators of the Supreme Court in their denial of prayer and their betrayal of a nation.
Rioting followed. People got killed. The general was arrested and charged with insurrection. If some on the right feared post-war America's bloated government was infested by red conspiracy, some on the left and centre feared demagogues like Walker were conspiring against democracy. And books appeared with titles like The Power Elite. Even President Eisenhower had warned of the power of the military-industrial complex. But then Walker's friends in the John Birch Society saw Eisenhower as an agent of the communist conspiracy. The Republican Senator, Barry Goldwater, seemed keen to bring some of this extremism into the mainstream. This swirl of left liberal anxieties was brought together in a film written by Rod Serling and directed by John Frankenheimer. In 7 Days in May, a liberal president has to face down a conspiracy to overthrow him.
Every now and then a man on a white horse rides by and we appoint him to be our personal god for the duration. For some men it was a Senator McCarthy. For others it was a General Walker. Now it's a General Scott.
But then listen to what the hard right themselves were afraid of.
The thing the communists hope for is to get us to bankrupt ourselves, to throw this country into a recession and a depression such as this nation has never seen. And then the man on the white horse comes, and then the country falls to communism, and then God help us all.
The fact that, there appeared to be these people within the military brass who were completely consumed by these conspiracy theories, and the fact that the John Birch Society was generally understood by the mainstream of American media and the popular culture as a kind of equal and opposite danger to the communists in many ways, made it very credible to create a popular culture narrative in which generals believed that the people who were giving them orders were quislings.
Rick Perlstein, author of Before the Storm and Nixonland.
General Walker, you also had the failed incursion of the Bay of Pigs, where America, kind of set loose this insurgent army to take over Cuba. And as soon as they faced strong resistance on the beachhead, they were refused air cover. So this seemed like Kennedy and his generals had abandoned the attempt to roll back communism in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis, when that happened, you had all sorts of people within the military arguing that we should have gone in with guns blazing. So the idea that these people could try and effect a military coup seemed credible in 1964.
President Kennedy himself seems to have thought so. He ignored Pentagon hostility to permit shooting outside the White House. But before the movie reached cinemas,
The Diary of Disaster began with the barely credible agency message that President Kennedy had been shot.
The immediate response to just about everyone, within the general culture after Kennedy's assassination, was that these people who were talking about Kennedy as a cat's paw of the communist conspiracy had to be the people who had done it, right? I mean, motive, means, and opportunity. Even John F. Kennedy, before his tour to Dallas, said he was heading into nut country. This was the home of H.L. Hunt, the oil billionaire who sponsored radio broadcasts and radio ads and newspaper ads, literally calling John F. Kennedy a traitor. There were ads all over on lampposts in Dallas with Kennedy in the crosshairs. And immediately afterwards, you began to see people basically ready to pursue vigilante violence against the people who must have been responsible. I spoke to one of Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign staffers who said they basically had to lock down their office. There were people shooting through windows, right? The idea was, these had to be the people who were responsible. Lo and behold, it turns out to be this oddball Castroite, Lee Harvey Oswald, and everything seems up in the air.
Just a few days after the assassination, the BBC's Panorama spoke to senators on the Capitol steps.
Well, we're fundamentally grappling with a miasma of hatred, because while the murder of President Kennedy was apparently committed by a man of the extreme left, the propaganda of hatred preached by the extreme right has poisoned the atmosphere of certain cities.
Some saw Kennedy's death as a symptom as much of right-wing intolerance as left. The reporter put this to the hard right Storm Thurmond, an opponent, like General Walker, of Kennedy's civil rights bill.
It's a concentration of power in the national government, which is contrary to the Constitution.
Aren't you fostering, Senator, the forces of extremism which many think are responsible for the president's assassination?
Well, of course not. That's ridiculous. I'm amazed that you'd even ask such a question.
General Walker himself argued that, given that the president was shot by a left-winger, Lee Harvey Oswald, the blame lay with those who'd stopped Joe McCarthy's battle with the communist conspiracy.
He was exploring communism and the depth of its penetration into the government of the United States.
and he certainly had every right to. And if we had explored a little further with him, and the then President Eisenhower hadn't cut off his exploration with every effort possible, we might not have had the assassination we've had now.
This all seemed too good for Walker to be true. The hated president killed by the hated left. Many people could not believe that the president of the most powerful state in the history of the world could have been killed by a single man, and a left-wing man at that, however wayward. Theories rapidly appeared contending that larger, more powerful, more right-wing forces were responsible. And these were given credence by America's descent into polarization and crisis.
This is all happening, of course, against the backdrop of the rise of the Vietnam War, which literally was a conspiracy. If you look at the Gulf of Tonkin and how Lyndon Johnson basically made up a story in order to win a 98-2 authorization vote to escalate this war based on something that hadn't actually happened. The idea that Lyndon Johnson lied regularly made it much easier to believe that all the institutions of America were, in fact, hiding horrors just beneath the surface.
There came to be really a new concern about the idea that the American government was actively conspiring against its own citizens.
Professor Beverly Gage of Yale University, who's writing a biography of FBI founder J. Edgar Hoover.
In 1971, some anti-war activists broke into an FBI office and they stole all of the FBI files. And what they found out from that was that, as many people had suspected, the FBI had been not only spying on purely the anti-war movement, the New Left, the civil rights movement, but that they had been actively seeking to kind of disrupt these organizations, sending anonymous letters, trying to manipulate people with rumors, putting informants in. Many of the movements really organized themselves around this set of assumptions, questions about who's an informant, who this new stranger is who's showed up to attend meetings all of a sudden. All of this was already part of a kind of folk language, part of a common understanding of what might be going on even before people knew for sure exactly what was happening.
The high walls of the national security state provided a blank canvas onto which theorists could project their suspicions. Once again, Hollywood dramatised a scenario for a coup against a president. In 1973, the former communist screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, a veteran of the blacklist and a stint in jail, wrote a conspiracy thriller about the assassination of President Kennedy.
Never before in American history has one family held such an enormous concentration of political power. The plan is perfectly plain: to retain and perpetuate this power for decades. 2 terms for JFK, 2 for Bobby, and 2 for Ted.
In Executive Action, directed by David Miller, a cabal of powerful racist figures, businessmen and an ex-CIA agent, fear that the Kennedys are concocting a conspiracy.
They have put together a powerful coalition of big city machines, labor, Negroes, Jews, liberals, and the press that will make him unbeatable in 1964.
So the cabal concocts a conspiracy of its own. This was a wilderness of mirrors, each side reinforcing the other's fear of conspiracies and invisible governments, and it reached right into President Nixon's White House. Professor Paul Cobley of the University of Middlesex.
Nixonian and anti-Nixonian paranoia enjoyed a kind of symbiotic relationship. Nixon always seemed to be very much embattled.
We've got a counter-government here, and we've got to fight it. I don't give a damn how it is done.
Even when speaking to his protective hard men, he taped all the White House conversations. Nixon's paranoia and attempts at control therefore left a trail of evidence which justified, on the other hand, paranoid interpretations of the abuse of presidential power.
The Watergate scandal over attempts of the Nixon White House to cover up its dirty tricks operations against the Democrats, and the Kennedy assassination. These two remain entangled as stories of conspirators in the shadows. The former CIA man Howard Hunt plotted the break-in and bugging operation at the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building. But he was also suspected by some of involvement in assassinating Kennedy. Nixon's chief of staff, meanwhile, like General Walker, was something of a Kennedy assassination conspiracist. This is a tangle to compete with anything we face today. So how do we tell the difference between a fake conspiracy and a real one? I was puzzling over this when I read a research paper from a team at the University of California in Los Angeles, which uses something called computational folklore to suggest a striking set of answers to this question. Professor Tim Tangolini explains.
A lot of social media has given us a self-archiving folklore collection. So we now have access to all of the different expressions of millions of people, all negotiating aspects of their culture online.
So the study involved analysing many different versions of narratives told back and forth between people, in this case on social media. From this, a team led by Professor Bhavani Roy-Chaudhury used AI to extract the basic narrative structure in the form of actants and the connections between them, what they call edges.
In a post, you get a small snippet of an underlying narrative. We go post by post. We distill out who are the actants and what are they doing to each other. We have an algorithm to put these little bits of the network together. You start seeing the structure just kind of jump out at you. It's like a 30,000 foot level view of how humans create stories.
So if there was a theory about me and a friend plotting together, we'd each be an actant, and the connection between us would be called an edge, making up a very simple network. This pattern of actants and edges is turned into a narrative graph, a diagram of the links between the people and places in the story. They applied this to two narratives, an actual conspiracy called Bridgegate and a baseless conspiracy theory called Pizzagate, which drew on emails from the Democratic National Committee made public by WikiLeaks during the 2016 presidential election to make bizarre and horrific claims.
The Pizzagate conspiracy theory jumped onto the scene in October of 2016, and the general idea of this narrative was that certain political operatives in the Democratic Party, particularly the Podesta brothers, were involved in a child trafficking ring that was centered on a Northwest Washington, D.C. pizza parlor that was owned by someone named James Alefantis, who had supported the Clinton Foundation, and John Podesta was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. And through a series of underground tunnels, they were trafficking children for pedophilic, satanic, cannibalistic rituals. None of this is true. This is not happening. The other thing we worked on was Bridgegate, which was an actual conspiracy of a small number of actors in New Jersey politics and the Port Authority who were trying to take revenge on a Democratic mayor of a small New Jersey city called Fort Lee because he had refused to endorse Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, in his run for re-election. They weaponized traffic by creating possibly one of the world's greatest traffic jams for 5 days on the George Washington Bridge.
The first difference between the baseless conspiracy theory and the actual conspiracy was how rapidly the online narrative that the team were mapping emerged. The actual conspiracy, Bridgegate, did not come together rapidly at all.
That story came out in drips and drabs over many years, and the narrative was pieced together by investigative journalists.
The Pizzagate narrative took shape much faster and in a completely different way to Bridgegate.
The very rapid and stable set of actants and relationships developed over the course of just a few months, if not weeks, in October of 2016, sort of in the run-up to the presidential election, that really leveraged online discussions where people could collaboratively and sort of crowdsource an interpretation of what they felt were cryptic elements in the emails that had been hacked from the DNC. Now, these cryptic elements were things like, do you like pizza? You know, that in normal English is not a cryptic statement, but it was made cryptic and then it was interpreted as part of this elaborate narrative construction.
Once the team had turned each conspiracy story into a narrative graph, they compared the structures. How many domains were involved and how strongly were they connected? One way to test this is to see how many connections, edges, you have to remove to make the narrative structure collapse.
In the case of Bridgegate, what you see is strong connections amongst the different actors and actants. They represent primarily New Jersey politics. They all knew each other. They all kind of worked with each other, either as adversaries or as collaborators. So you have to remove a lot of edges here to make this network fall apart into different disconnected pieces.
Whereas with the baseless conspiracy theory,
the entire Pizzagate narrative was held together by the interpretation of the WikiLeaks.
So the UCLA team concluded that in a real conspiracy like Bridgegate, there are relatively few domains, and that the links between them are evidenced and strong, whereas in a conspiracy theory like Pizzagate, there are multiple domains, ranging from a pizza restaurant to Hillary Clinton to cannibals, and the links between them are weaker, and sometimes they depend on assertions of hidden knowledge or on creative interpretation.
That multi-domain element of the conspiracy theory might be one of the telltales that what we're dealing with here narratively is a conspiracy theory as opposed to the discovery of conspiracy. I think what's interesting about conspiracy is it tends to hide in the dense forest of nodes and their interconnections, these lines between the dots on the graph. Whereas conspiracy theory is trying not to hide. Conspiracy theory is trying to make absolutely clear these vast connections between otherwise completely unlinked domains.
So this suggests that a real conspiracy will be limited in scope and gradually revealed with each new piece of evidence. A conspiracy theory, meanwhile, will work more like a piece of folklore, starting from certainty and imaginatively connecting apparently unconnected domains to give a totalizing explanation of how the world works, and perhaps, like a folktale, to tell a story of good and evil. Now clearly there are plenty of differences between the grave concerns raised by the Kennedy assassination and the total fiction of Pizzagate. And Bridgegate was smaller and simpler than Watergate. Nonetheless, the UCLA model does suggest ways to distinguish between post-war America's two great intertwined conspiracy narratives. To start with, there's that question of the speed with which the story and its suspects emerged.
With the Kennedy assassination, from the moment that it happens, there are conspiracy theories. Cubans, Russians, the US government itself, a wide variety of actors who could have been involved. There was much more secrecy within the government. And so when you get to a dramatic moment like the Kennedy assassination, all of these kind of inchoate concerns then really come down, and a lot of people project all of these ideas, organized crime, Soviet espionage, onto this particular event. Whereas Watergate was much more of a slow build crisis. So to the degree that we think of the break-in at the Democratic National Committee in June of 1972 as kind of the initiating moment of Watergate, unlike the assassination, right, it didn't have a very dramatic opening. Most people didn't think that it was going to be anything particularly conspiratorial for quite a long time. It's as the investigation moves forward, it's as journalists push forward with the inquiries, and then finally as Congress takes it up, that this conspiracy begins to unfold.
Research into the Kennedy assassination has amassed mountains of detail, far beyond what we can explore in this programme, but there is something more folkloric than historically accurate about the story of Kennedy as the martyr murdered by the military-industrial complex so they could invade Vietnam. And in line with the sense that it was just too convenient that Kennedy had been shot by a lone leftist, and the American state's high levels of secrecy, it's not surprising that some of the theories that emerged depended on the idea that crucial connections were hidden.
Conspiracy theorists start interpreting and drawing connections and propose access to some hidden knowledge or some secret knowledge that provides an alternate and totalizing narrative that includes everything from Cuba and various other cabals that are linked together for the very specific purpose of assassinating the president. It doesn't help that there is some deliberate obfuscation and a lack of trust in the commission, the official report on the Kennedy assassination, and it certainly doesn't help that the main suspect and culprit is killed himself while leaving an arraignment. So there's enough questions about the accuracy of the information that people start to offer different storytelling scenarios, and some of these rely on this idea that I've got some hidden knowledge or I know how to interpret this, and that leads to the connection of all of these different domains.
The left-wing journalist I.F. Stone was a veteran of the battle against McCarthyism. But in 1964, he lost allies by accusing fellow left-wingers of generating narratives based on the kind of dubious connections McCarthy had once made.
All my adult life as a newspaperman, I have been fighting in defense of the left and of a sane politics against conspiracy theories of history, character assassination, guilt by association, and demonology. Now, I see elements of the left using these same tactics. in the controversy over the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission report.
There are much larger forces at work shaping your own life and your own existence. And there are people with a lot of power who aren't necessarily telling you everything that's going on, and how one grapples with that, how central it becomes to your understanding of how the world works. That's kind of the line between conspiracy thinking that really goes off the deep end and something that you might describe as, a kind of rational critique of big structures.
One way to resolve all this was a turn to fiction. This can use the implication of hidden knowledge much more freely to evoke implacable, far-reaching power. In 1974, the year Watergate finally destroyed Nixon, Alan J. Pakula's movie The Parallax View, written by David Giler and Lorenzo Semple Jr., drew on conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination. At one point, it has a US corporation ready to blow up a domestic passenger plane to kill a politician. But in a way, this doesn't make the film implausible because it works on the logic of folktale or nightmare. As Paul Cobley explains, the film associates the murder of a journalist with a congressional committee, not with evidence, but Pakula's direction and the eerie score by Michael Small.
The camera is coming towards it very slowly.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been invited here today for the official...
And you have the spoken pronouncement of the chair, which is almost like a voiceover because you can't see the mouth moving of the committee figures in the distance. And the voiceover gives the impression that the assassination that happened at the beginning of the film, the assassination of Senator Carroll, was carried out by a deranged gunman. It's music that's in a minor key. There's a brief, intermittent and discordant keyboard section. And over that, there's a kind of melancholy trumpet and a Copland-esque main theme, which for most viewers would, I think, signify the dignity of the American state, the grandeur of American government.
The committee wishes to emphasize that there is no evidence of any wider conspiracy.
Witnesses to the assassination that opens the film have been dying in mysterious circumstances. One witness, a journalist called Lee Carter, is terrified she'll be next. Her fellow journalist doesn't believe her. Cut to the mortuary.
There was enough alcohol and barbiturates in her bloodstream to have killed her if she'd fallen asleep in bed, let alone at the wheel of a car.
There's a slow zoom away from Lee's body out of the mortuary room, so it's almost a mirror image of the zoom on the committee. You get the minor key again. What the slow zoom out and the music is setting up is a very clear connection between the idea that the assassination was carried out by a lone deranged gunman, then a voiceover talking about barbiturates in the bloodstream. Clearly, appearances are deceptive.
And what about Watergate? The UCLA study suggests that real conspiracies are based on strong links between actants in just a very few domains.
It turns out to be the committee to re-elect the president and burglaries at the Democratic National Committee. But ultimately, you are really within the domain of presidential politics, and these burglars were employed by people who have many, many other connections to the White House.
The FBI and the CIA were both involved in the sense that they trained many of the people who ultimately went on to be involved both in the break-in itself and then in various aspects of the cover-up. I haven't seen a lot of evidence that they were more involved than that. And in fact, by 1972, 73, 74, certainly the FBI, to some degree also the CIA, they're pretty suspicious of the Nixon administration.
Whatever the full complexities of Watergate and its cover-up, the basic conspiracy narrative seems to pass the UCLA test. Unlike some Kennedy conspiracies, you'd have to break a lot of links between the key players to make it collapse. Perhaps, though, there's another distinction. Unlike Watergate, the Kennedy assassination was a traumatic defeat. And conspiracy theories often appear in response to such feelings, whether it's General Walker railing against desegregation or Dalton Trumbo pushing back at the military-industrial complex. In the 1990s, after the long dominance of Nixon, Reagan and Bush, it was the American right who began to feel once again that they were on the losing side. And guess what happened?
Clinton's victory in 1992 fuels a whole new set of conspiracies about the deceptions, the manipulations that must have occurred in order to have produced this kind of political outcome. So from the very beginning of his presidency, Clinton was really dogged by these conspiratorial accusations that were sometimes about his business dealings, they were sometimes about his sex life. Clinton, of course, had enough vulnerabilities in many of these areas to give some fuel to some of this conspiratorial thinking. But the 90s really produces a whole new culture around this idea of fraud and deceit as being the only possible explanations for the rise and success of a figure like Clinton.
Next time, we'll explore how that turn is still playing out. Meanwhile, in case you were wondering who shot at General Walker in Dallas a few months before Kennedy was shot there, well, according to 2 investigations, that was Lee Harvey Oswald, too.
We all want to turn over an evil empire, we all want to be Luke Skywalker, and we look for that in many ways. I remember as a kid having a fantasy that the world was invaded by aliens and I ended up in the woods fighting for the resistance. I would spend hours in this imaginary world.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
We're storming the Capitol. It's a revolution. Stop protecting tyrants.
Freedom is paid for with blood, and tyranny always masquerades itself as safety and security, and that's what we're fighting against right now.
We all carry stories around in our heads. They're part of how we make sense of the world. But then political shocks crash in on those stories, from election defeat to COVID. So in this episode, I want to trace how some people get from there to believing in conspiracy theories, and see how all this looks to a creator of conspiracy fiction. So this is Conspiracies, The Secret Knowledge. Episode 3, The Secret Knowledge. Let's begin with those stories in our heads.
Since very early age, we are being brought into the culture of how we do things, the norms, the beliefs, and the values of the group that we're a part of.
Computational folklorist Tim Tangolini.
There's a collective repertoire of stories and story parts that we can rely on as we try to fit a new event, a new experience into this collective worldview.
Whitney Phillips is co-author with Ryan Milner of You Are Here, a field guide to conspiracy theories. Together, they developed the idea of deep memetic frames.
When you already have that underlying feeling that this is how things are, and this is who the good guys are, and this is who the bad guys are, then when you encounter information in the world, it ends up providing evidence for the frame.
One issue that these frames and stories help people to contend with is their relationship to power. And here's our second step.
Everybody has the potential to believe in conspiracy theories. It's just a natural byproduct of the way that we process information when we're uncertain and feel threatened.
Karen Douglas, a professor of social psychology at the University of Kent, argues that feeling powerless or defeated can attract people to stories about the threat of the powerful.
There is definitely some evidence to suggest that people who are on the losing side of any political contest tend to believe in conspiracy theories more and share these sorts of beliefs more. Political scientists have shown this sort of effect. So you resort to these conspiracy theories as a way to try to kind of make sense of what's going on.
So what are the inner stories that people turn to when they feel threatened or powerless? Dennis Kelly, that kid who once fantasized about fighting off aliens, grew up to be a playwright and a screenwriter. He sees an inherent attraction in that story that he used to act out as a child, being one of a few brave rebels who understand what's really going on.
There's something about being a plucky little band of truth knowers that change everything that is really, really alluring. It happens in conspiracy theories and it happens in narrative.
One of the pervasive deep memetic frames you see a lot in the United States right now is the general sense that liberals, which becomes associated with public health expertise, the media, that the liberals are out to get conservatives. They're trying to do all of these things to take the country away from us. That's central to a lot of the COVID denialism, the idea that the liberals are sort of exaggerating the threat or they're otherwise trying to use COVID to their own advantage, which is in turn what inspires people to resist mask ordinances or social distancing ordinances. The idea that liberals are coming to take America away from us, that also is central to this idea that Joe Biden actually stole the election from Trump. And underneath that claim is this idea that, of course, they would try to steal the election. They are capable of doing anything that's in their interest.
This way of thinking came to the fore in the 1990s as conservatives in America were pushed onto the back foot politically, and conspiracy theories sprang up about the Clintons. But it wasn't always conservatives who felt they were on the losing side.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room.
Just look at the impact of a 1990s pop culture phenomenon, the Wachowskis' 1999 movie, The Matrix, and you see a curious shift.
It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo.
In some ways, The Matrix is Marx plus IT, an AI version of conspiracy theories about the oppressive system from the time when it was the left who felt they were losing. Intelligent machines keep humankind in tanks to harvest their body's energy, keeping them oblivious with false consciousness, a permanent hallucination that they're leading ordinary, pleasant lives. Only a plucky little band of truth-knowers, under constant threat of defeat, can see the true horror of the world.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
The movie even ends with the band Rage Against the Machine's track, Wake Up. This was released in 1992, but it really springs from the paranoia of the 60s and 70s. As we read the credits, we hear that Martin Luther King was assassinated by departments of police, the judges and the feds, for talking about Vietnam. But The Matrix and its Rage Against the Machine has long been adopted by right-wing conspiracy theorists, especially that idea of red pilling, which neatly dramatises the staple conspiracy theory idea that nothing is as it seems, that the world is supposedly controlled by the banksters, the Rothschilds and George Soros, as one popular anti-Semitic red pill-themed YouTube account, now shut down, used to claim.
The Matrix has definitely provided conspiracy theorists with a language to talk about their experiences.
Michael Butter, author of The Nature of Conspiracy Theories.
This imagery of waking up is one that we already had in the 18th century. But this idea of taking the red pill and seeing the world suddenly for what it is has really taken hold in some parts of the conspiracy theory community.
It's not surprising that Americans of left and right respond readily to the idea of being plucky rebels battling the conspiracies of an evil tyrant. This has been ingrained in the folklore of the United States for a long time. Just listen to the story that its founding document, the Declaration of Independence, tells about King George III.
He is, at this time, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny.
He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our
We would not
frontiers.
have had the American Revolution at the time when it occurred without a widespread belief in conspiracy theories. Many of the colonists came to believe that there was a widespread plot against liberty orchestrated by George III and his ministers. And for many people living in the colonies, including George Washington, but also Thomas Jefferson, this legitimized their revolution.
So this might be one frame through which Americans, including Stop the Steal conspiracists, see the world. But Americans are not the only people who see themselves as a band of truth-knowers resisting tyranny. In this country too, we're very good at detecting conspiracies to crush our liberty. If some Americans see the world through the conspiracism of the Declaration of Independence, some in Britain see the world through George Orwell's novel, 1984.
Being in a minority, even a minority of one, did not make you mad. There was truth and there was untruth. And if you clung to the truth, even against the whole world, you were not mad.
Orwell's novel remains one of the great denunciations of the misery of a mind under the totalitarian iron heel. But it has also provided a ready vocabulary to throw at phantom tyrannies. When lockdown began, it did not take long for graffiti to appear reading COVID-19 84.
Conspiracy theories do tend to emerge after large-scale events or crises in society, and of course we're in the middle of such a situation right now. These sorts of everyday, mundane explanations that might seem to be coming our way from officialdom don't seem sufficient to account for the size of the event, so people come to the conclusion that something else must have happened.
So there are the stories and deep mimetic frames that we have in our heads, and then the sense of defeat or powerlessness. The next step is the embrace of a particular kind of narrative logic.
The American political scientist Michael Barkun has claimed that conspiracy theories all make three major assumptions. First, nothing happens by accident. Second, everything is connected. And third, nothing is as it seems.
Let's explore how the idea that everything is connected has played out through the baseless QAnon conspiracy theory. Its broad narrative framework is the idea of a vastly powerful deep state, supposedly involved in strange, horrific acts. The phrase has surprising origins. It came to prominence through a 2014 book by a disillusioned moderate Republican called Mike Lofgren, denouncing the permanent relationship between the national security state, the US Treasury, Wall Street and corporations. And Lofgren got the phrase from a 2013 novel by John le Carré called A Delicate Truth, which was critical of the privatisation of aspects of the British secret state.
All Emily wanted to know was who had murdered Jeb, assuming he was murdered, which in turn led Toby into a rather inarticulate condemnation of the deep state, and thence into a denunciation of the ever-expanding circle of non-governmental insiders from banking, industry and commerce who were cleared for highly classified information denied to large swathes of Whitehall and Westminster.
This long-standing image of an invisible, unaccountable government came to express something much more bizarre. As Whitney Phillips explains, when Trump came under investigation, the idea of the deep state was used to connect conspiracy theories about this with another theory, which had emerged before Trump was elected.
So it wasn't until Trump was already in office, and then, the Mueller investigation was opened after he fired James Comey, then suddenly there's this huge spike in the idea of deep state. And what happened is that all of the conspiracy theories, Pizzagate in particular, that had been swirling during the election, got absorbed into this new idea of the deep state.
The accusation came from this unhinged story that originated online days before the election, saying that Hillary Clinton and her campaign chairman John Podesta were operating a child sex ring. The lie took
Pizzagate was never about Donald Trump as president, but once he was president, it was built into this narrative that started to then absorb every news story that emerged. First, you had the Epstein revelations. The sex ring that was actually happening seemed to confirm exactly what Pizzagate was arguing, that what Jeffrey Epstein did in the world was real, but it connected to this previous conspiracy theory in a way that lent it a lot of credence to believers.
When it comes to President Trump, what you have to understand is that he's like the good cop that's coming out and doing what it is that a lot of people don't want him to do in this cabal, in this global organization. And they thought that he was a part of their group, okay? Because he was at, their parties and he's in pictures with Jeffrey Epstein and shit like that. But he also kicked Jeffrey Epstein out of the hotel when he found out he was hitting on 15-year-old girls and stuff.
Then you have impeachment unfold. And that too then became roped into the broader deep state narrative because look, now we have evidence, according to believers, that the Democrats are trying to take Trump down.
In a tweet, Trump pushed his unfounded theory that there is a deep state embedded within the FDA.
And when COVID entered the scene, now suddenly there's even more dots to connect to this ever-expanding, very sort of narratively hungry conspiracy theory. So COVID being a hoax, COVID being the work of the deep state, that was something that was absorbed into the narrative and then exacerbated too when Trump himself referred to the deep state in the FDA, that they were slowing down the vaccine because they wanted to hurt his re-election chances. To non-believers, these events are unconnected, they're just dots. But to people who already have this overarching narrative, those dots then get threaded into this narrative, creating this really extensive, detailed tapestry that is just ready for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, accruing additional sort of strength and visibility as it moves.
This is what happens when you start with your supposed villains in place and then attach any evidence to them that seems to suit your case. This is why everything is connected. This narrative logic is the opposite of a historian's. Sir Richard Evans is the author of The Hitler Conspiracies, which arose from a research project he led on conspiracy thinking.
One of the common features of conspiracy theories is that they have as a premise that nothing happens without someone having intended it to happen. So a conspiracy, of course, is a secret meeting or group of people who plot something. They have to have an actual aim in mind. And if you turn it kind of upside down, what conspiracy theorists don't accept is that things happen by chance. They must have been intended.
Evans argues that one false connection often made by conspiracy theorists is between an argument and the person making it.
It's a difficult principle to grasp, but a really fundamental one, that the question of who puts forward an argument has nothing at all to do with whether the argument is right or wrong. It might explain why that person is putting forward the argument, but you have to tackle it on its own terms. And that's perhaps the most common defense of conspiracy theorists against their critics, that those people must themselves be part of the conspiracy. I ran a big project in Cambridge over 5 years, finished quite recently, on conspiracy and conspiracy theorists. It was funded by the Leverhulme Trust. The conspiracists started putting up posts and tweets saying, oh, look, Lord Leverhulme was a Freemason. What can you expect? Of course, they're trying to defend their own. But that's got nothing to do with it. You have to tackle the arguments on their own terms.
But in fiction, if everything is connected and nothing is accidental, that's a hard-won achievement. In 2013, Channel 4 screened Dennis Kelly's dystopic series Utopia, produced by Kudos and directed by Mark Munden, Alex Garcia Lopez and Wayne Chi Yip. This follows the fans of a graphic novel about a conspiracy theory who begin to realise that the conspiracy is real and find themselves up against the mysterious network.
Those two things are exactly what you want in a drama. Everything's connected and nothing's a coincidence. That folding things back in like that, that's a great drama. And sort of realising in the third act that little thing that happened in the first act really has an impact is really, really satisfying. That's just not how the world works, though. The world is just sort of floppy and strange and bizarre, and there are lots of dead ends. The really important thing is narrative isn't real, and I think that's what's so sort of alluring about conspiracies, is that they're narratives.
Michael, you make trouble, yes.
There's a character called Dugdale, and he's with a Russian prostitute who turns out to be a member of the network.
Oh, Anya, no, don't, he's not what...
I had no idea when I was writing it that she was. I thought that was genuinely something that was going on.
I have a situation. I need to speak to Control now.
It was very easy for me to then go back and make her do something that made that make sense. In a narrative, that's exactly what you do. You rewrite backwards. But I guess that's what you do in conspiracy theories as well, isn't it? You can go back and rewrite reality.
So this suggests that conspiracy theories construct their narratives about power with the logic not of a historian or a journalist, but a screenwriter, connecting everything they're concerned about back to the machinations of a single malign tyrannical force. George III, or Big Brother, or the Matrix, or the Deep State. And this takes us to our final step. Conspiracy theorists often exhort each other to do your own research. So I asked Richard Evans, who spent decades doing his own research, what the difference is between how he does it and how the conspiracy theorists he's been studying do it. To explain, he cited a classic example of an event that has attracted much conspiracy thinking: the burning of the Reichstag in 1933.
As far as Hitler and Goering were concerned, there was no question that this was a conspiracy of the communists.
This was the suspiciously convenient moment when Hitler, newly arrived in power, was able to blame his arch-enemies, the communists, for torching the German parliament. Hardly anyone believed that story. A lone non-communist leftist called Marinus van der Lubbe was convicted. But the communists alleged that the Nazis had organised the fire themselves, and it was so helpful in giving the Nazis the pretext to brutally tighten their grip on power that many people believed that it must indeed have been the Nazis who did it.
What's different about professional historians is that You formulate a hypothesis, let's say. You always do that because it helps you then cut your way through the huge mass of evidence that we have to sift. And you start going through it. You say, right, let's say, who started the Reichstag fire? Possibly it was the Nazis. So you start looking for the evidence. But if it does not there, if it doesn't turn up, and if there's a load of evidence that tells against it, so van der Lubbe, for example, always maintained up to the moment of his executions that he'd done it alone. Nobody told him what to do. It was his idea. You don't invent unprovable hypotheses. For example, some conspiracists have said, oh, he must have been drugged or he must have been hypnotized. There's absolutely no evidence of this at all. So you change your mind. If you can't find proof to back your hypothesis, then you chuck out the hypothesis and you try and find a new one which has a better fit with the actual evidence.
So there is that last step. A belief that hidden or secret knowledge exists that confirms the existence of the conspiracy. And once again, as with the idea that everything is connected, history's no-nos are fiction's goals. Secret knowledge and unprovable hypotheses are perfect for drama. In Utopia, our plucky little band of truth-knowers is up against yet another implacable conspiratorial force.
The West panicked and created an organization to combat the threat. It was known as the Network. It was based in no country, reported to no one, and was utterly deniable. It did things democratic governments couldn't. They were insane, totally out of control.
One of the big things that I discovered was the less you knew, the better it was. Opening up the network and really discovering who the network are. That would sort of be a mistake. We want the network to be shadowy. We don't want to know how the network's human resources department work. We don't want to know how they actually speak with MI5 or how they speak with the CIA. It's a really glib thing to say, you know, the network, they're everywhere. If you stop and go, hold on, how are they? Where are the connections? How do they communicate? Who are the personnel that do this? And how do you approach someone like that? It all soon falls to pieces. But actually, you can just say that really, really quickly and it sort of holds water.
But some people try to be the kind of plucky band of truth-knowers who take on the network in Utopia in real life.
One of the main findings as well in the psychology of conspiracy theories is that people who have lower levels of education tend to believe in conspiracy theories more. And that's not to say that they're not clever people, it's just that they haven't necessarily had the experience and the tools to be able to create those critical thinking skills to be able to reject conspiracy theories. But at the same time as well, they might be confronted with these experts all the time and think, well, you know, why should I listen to you? It can feel very alienating. And I think that a lot of people who believe strongly in conspiracy theories do see themselves as these warriors, I think, defenders of the truth. And so there is this element of rebelliousness, and we're the ones that are trying to defend everybody else from these experts. We're trying to defend everybody else so that they can better understand the truth. There's definitely this element of feeling like a truth warrior, or a rebel against a system that you can't trust.
The idea of secret knowledge not only cements the conspiracy theory, it also offers the prospect of an antidote to feeling powerless or defeated.
They allow people to feel, at least in some way, that they're in possession of information that's powerful. This is information that other people don't have, so it might allow people to feel that they've regained at least some power.
Whitney Phillips argues that it's no use simply pointing out that the elements of a conspiracy theory aren't connected, without acknowledging the underlying patterns of story and belief, and why people value them.
Having that lack of understanding of how folklore works, how it coheres people's worldviews, how old those views are, how coherent and rational they feel to the people who believe them, not to take that seriously means that we will only ever be at an impasse in how we can respond to these kinds of theories.
And in the wake of making Utopia, Dennis Kelly had an encounter at a speaking event with a man who seems to have found his fiction all too convincing.
This bloke stopped me and said, "Don't go without talking to me. I'm your greatest fan." He was a nice enough guy, but what I found strange was that he started talking about Utopia and he was mad for it, you know. And I realised as he was talking, he believed it. He really believed all this stuff, you know. And I had to sort of stop him and go, "Look, I've got to be honest with you, mate. I just made all that up." And he kind of wouldn't believe that. He knew it was true what I was saying, that I'd made it up, but he still believed that there were true things in there. It was a strange feeling because in one moment you're telling someone the truth, and also you're really disappointing them. You're really kind of crushing them. He seemed like a decent enough person, but he just absolutely believed in it. I think it was that moment that I really began to understand how, things have changed since from when I wrote Utopia, and conspiracy theories are just embedded in our culture so much more.
The plucky band of truth knowers in Utopia do their best to destroy a vaccine that, in the story, is designed to make most of the world infertile. Not surprisingly, Kelly has found the pandemic has cast a drama he wrote a decade ago in a very different light.
I think I'd find it very difficult to do Utopia now. I would feel my responsibilities were very different. When you have someone who was, for the last 4 years, the most powerful man in the world, who seems to be happy with conspiracy theories, whether he believed them or not, I don't know, but he was happy that other people believed them, certainly if it was good for him. And particularly with the pandemic and the vaccine and anti-vaxxers and all of that sort of thing. I knew there were anti-vaxxers. I knew a lot about that, but it genuinely wasn't common currency that, I remember discovering that there were people out there that thought that vaccines would sterilise you. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because I thought I just made that up. But there were actually people out there that believed it, But now there's many, many more.
Perhaps the real secret knowledge at the heart of conspiracy narratives is that they're not a representation of real-world power, so much as of the psychology of their own believers. For some, the act of dismissing expertise and evidence in favour of a crowd-composed folktale like QAnon seems to be an act of rebellion, a rebellion by people who feel powerless against those who normally control the narrative. And perhaps the more absurd it is, the greater the rebellion. In so doing, they get to create their own secret knowledge, the more exclusive for its lack of evidence. In their own narrative, they themselves can become a powerful elite. The problem is it may simply not work.
There's absolutely no evidence that believing in conspiracy theories is empowering. If anything, the evidence suggests that conspiracy theories makes people feel worse. It actually makes people feel more powerless.
So how is a person supposed to fight back against the powerful? Maybe there's a hint in the movie we began with. A matrix, by one definition, is a set of conditions that provides a system in which something grows or develops. Conspiracy theories imagine that such conditions and systems are plotted in secret meetings. But maybe power is more often a function of meetings of minds. Powerful people who share an ideology don't need to conspire. If you want to fight the power, better to fight the ideology than a phantom plot. And to let fiction be fiction, and to leave its tricks and tropes to screenwriters like Dennis Kelly, who argues that there's another reason the network in Utopia, in the end, is unbelievable.
Anyone who's had the tiniest connection to government, or even any reasonably large organisation, realises the sort of calamitous way in which these things bumble through. And it's not that there are all these connections, it's that there are all these connections in the network that are run by people that are actually capable of doing their job. Most of us have some sort of capacity with our job, but we kind of mess it up here and there, or we get in one day and we're really tired. But for the network to exist, you have to have thousands of people all over the world who are super, super bright, super committed, will never change their mind, and crucially are actually really, really capable. And those people just don't exist in the world.
That makes me think that actually the exhilarating thing about watching something like Utopia is it's basically the antidote to every time you're put on hold.
That's right. That's what it is. The network never put you on hold.